1941, the Soviet Union. For months, the Soviet leadership refuses to heed warnings from the Western powers of the German troop build-up along its western border. Thus, when on the 22nd of June 1941, Germany and its Axis partners invade the Soviet Union, they achieve almost complete tactical surprise. As the German army advances deep into Soviet territory, SS and police units follow the troops. The first to arrive are the Einsatzgruppen, the Nazi mobile death squads, who will conduct the mass shootings of Jews, communists, and other persons deemed to be dangerous to establishing long-term German rule on Soviet territory. On the 3rd of November 1941, the German 46th and 170th Infantry Divisions capture the Ukrainian coastal city of Feodosia. The Jewish population, men, women, children, and the elderly, numbering 3,248 people before the Nazi occupation, is murdered by the occupiers between the 16th of November and 15th of December 1941. However, on the 29th of December of the same year, Soviet Marine troops and regular infantry land on the beach of Feodosia, capture the city, and take revenge. As many as 160 German prisoners of war will lose their lives in a massacre, which is notable not only for the relatively high number of victims, but also the extreme cruelty demonstrated by the Soviet perpetrators. The 46th Infantry Division, which captured Feodosia in November 1941, was formed in 1938 under the command of General Paul von Haase. On the 1st of September of the following year, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, triggering the Second World War. The 46th Infantry Division took part in the Polish campaign, and its soldiers were involved in the murder of approximately 300 Polish civilians during the Częstochowa massacre. This massacre became known as Bloody Monday and was committed by the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, in the Polish city of Częstochowa between the 4th and 6th of September 1939. The shootings, beatings, and plunder continued for 3 days in more than a dozen separate locations around the city, and approximately 1,140 Polish civilians, 150 of whom were ethnically Jewish, were murdered. In the following year, the division participated in the Battle of France, which lasted from the 10th of May to the 25th of June 1940. It remained in France into 1941, before participating in the Axis invasion of Yugoslavia in April. During the invasion of the Soviet Union, which began on the 22nd of June 1941, the division was assigned to Army Group South and marched through Ukraine and into Crimea. On the 3rd of November, the 46th Infantry Division together with the 170th Infantry Division captured Feodosia. This mid-sized city on the Crimean coast of the Black Sea had a pre-war population of 28,000. The killings of Jews in the city began on the 16th of November 1941. On the 3rd of December, Erich von Manstein, the commander of Army Group South, gave the command of the 46th Infantry Division to Generalleutnant Hans Graf von Sponeck. In Feodosia, within the area of Sponeck's command, 1,052 Jews were murdered on or around the 10th of December 1941 by units of the Einsatzgruppe D, with the active cooperation and participation of the local military field commander and military police. By the 15th of December 1941, the Germans murdered the entire Jewish population of Feodosia. According to the documents of Einsatzgruppe D, more than 3,200 Jews in Feodosia were killed, along with hundreds of Crimean Jews, Romani people, and declared or suspected communists. Units of the Wehrmacht and military police assisted in the executions. A witness interviewed by the Soviet Extraordinary Commission in 1944 described how the Jews had been rounded up and massacred in the city. He said, "All the Jews were gathered. The Germans told them they would be displaced somewhere in Ukraine. On the 4th of December 1941, in the morning, all the Jews, including my father, my mother, and my sister, were taken to an anti-tank trench where they were executed by German shooters." 1,500 to 1,700 people were shot that day. The situation in the city changed dramatically on the 28th of December 1941, when Soviet Marine troops and regular infantry landed on the beach of Feodosia and captured it one day later. Von Sponeck chose to withdraw the division to avoid being caught and encircled by Soviet forces. In doing so, he disobeyed direct orders from Hitler to hold his ground. The 46th Infantry Division retreated 120 kilometers through a snowstorm in 2 days from the 30th to the 31st of December. A number of vehicles were abandoned due to a lack of fuel. Moving from Feodosia, the Soviet 63rd Mountain Infantry Division established a roadblock by the morning of the 31st of December, and after a brief fight, the German 46th took a detour cross-country through a narrow 10-kilometer gap between the lead Soviet elements and the Sea of Azov. The 46th avoided encirclement but suffered moderate equipment losses and light personnel casualties. Von Sponeck's order was highly controversial. There were insufficient German forces at Feodosia to stop further Soviet advances, but there were 20,000 Romanian troops in the vicinity and strong German reinforcements on the way. 2 Romanian brigades launched a counterattack on the 30th of December, but were defeated in large part due to their insufficient air and artillery support. In January 1942, von Sponeck was found guilty of disobedience to a superior officer and given the death sentence. On the 6th of November 1941, less than 2 months before the Red Army captured Feodosia from the German occupiers, Stalin gave his perseverance speech, in which he said, "If the Germans want a war of extermination, then that is what they will get. From now on, it will be our task, the task of the peoples of the Soviet Union, the task of the fighters, the commanders and the political functionaries of our army and our fleet, to destroy all Germans who have invaded the territory of our homeland as occupiers, down to the last man. No mercy for the German occupiers, death to the German occupiers. The task is to wipe out all German occupiers to the last man." The next day, on the 7th of November, Stalin struck the same tones at a parade on Red Square, saying, "The German invaders must be crushed and utterly destroyed, and only death remains for them." When the Soviets captured Feodosia in late December 1941, another massacre began. However, this time it was committed by the Soviet troops. In several military hospitals in the city, about 160 seriously wounded and sick German soldiers who were not transportable had been left behind. A handful of German and Russian doctors and orderlies remained at their side. In addition, several dozen Germans were arrested and imprisoned. According to the statements of Russian nurses, doctors, and surviving Germans, the following occurred between Monday, the 29th of December 1941, and Thursday, the 1st of January 1942. Drunken Russian Marines entered the military hospitals, shot many of the nurses and doctors, including the Russians, and then began to massacre the wounded in the cruelest way. From the main military hospital, right on the shore, wounded soldiers were thrown through the windows several meters high and down rocks, or they were carried outside, mutilated, and doused with water, until their bodies were covered in ice, as if encased in glass. German troops retook Feodosia on the 18th of January 1942, and were shocked to discover what happened to their comrades they had left behind. A staff physician named Rudolf Burkhardt reported on a sand hill on the beach in front of the military hospital. He said, "After removing a layer of sand about a hand's width thick, I found that beneath it were piles of corpses. I was able to determine beyond doubt that the corpses belonged to the seriously wounded of my military hospital. Most of the corpses were still wearing plaster casts and splints. Many of the corpses showed first, second, and third-degree frostbite on the uncovered limbs, so the seriously wounded must have been laying on the beach when they were still alive and exposed to the cold." Burkhardt continued saying, "Some of the plaster casts were broken. Blood and pus had seeped out of the cracks. About 50 meters from the hill lay the body of a wounded man covered by sand. 10 meters further lay another German body, which had been covered by seawater and turned into a layer of glass. In a Russian cemetery, more than 100 corpses of German soldiers were found, piled up in a house and inspected by me. Among them were about 60 wounded who had already received medical treatment, as could be seen from the bandages and splints. These approximately 100 corpses clearly showed signs that justified the conclusion that they had been bludgeoned to death with blunt objects. Lieutenant Hans-Friedrich testified in late January 1942 about what he saw in Feodosia when the Germans recaptured the city. He said, "In the former German military hospital, which is housed in a mosque-like building, the bodies of about 50 German soldiers lie in 2 large rooms. All the corpses are horribly mutilated. Some of them have their heads smashed into an unrecognizable mass. Some have their ears cut off, others their noses, and some have their mouths open and their tongues torn out. Some have their hands chopped off, their eyes gouged out, or their bodies wounded by knife stabs or knife cuts. Some have their genitals cut off. Many show several of the mutilations described." According to reports, other wounded were left lying on the street for days before being shot in the face. Some were thrown out of Red Cross ambulances. Of the uninjured German prisoners, most were shot, mostly by Soviet political commissars. However, 12 German soldiers survived the massacre by luck. Such was the case of a private named Anton Niedermeyer, who was shot in a cellar room with others but survived the shot to the neck because the bullet missed the spine and came out in his face. He stated that 23 of his comrades had been killed, and that he and 7 others had been able to hide for several days until German troops retook Feodosia on the 18th of January, 1942. After retaking Feodosia on that day, the shocked German soldiers took revenge by shooting many prisoners and killing the few Jews who had survived the earlier massacres. Other suspects were murdered as well. Feodosia was finally liberated by the Red Army in April 1944. There were many tears shed for all the victims of Nazi terror.
Thanks for watching the World History Channel. Be sure to like and subscribe, and click the bell notification icon so you don't miss our next episodes. We thank you, and we'll see you next time on the channel.